In the last video, I spent time talking about the power of stories, but today I want to spend some time unpacking the essentials of what make a story to help us understand how stories work. A story, almost all of them, has to have at least 3 ingredients. The first one is it has to have a setting. Where does this story happen? Often this is really simple and really easy to help you understand. They say it in the first line. Most famous one of all is, "A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away." It starts it. It's the first line that they put in Star Wars before they start every single one of those movies. Why? Because they need you to understand the setting. The setting is where the story takes place. That sets our expectations about what can happen inside the story. Oh, it's in a galaxy far, far away, and it's in outer space. Well, that probably means it's not going to conform to some of the things that I currently live with. For instance, in Tolkien's The Hobbit, there was a hobbit who lived in the ground. Well, okay, this is not obviously going to be the kind of place that I currently live because I don't know what a hobbit is, and most of the people I know don't live in holes in the ground. So the setting sets the expectations about what a story is going to be about. Whereas if I told a story about my own life and you knew that it happened in this world in this time with these set of expectations, that would have a different effect in terms of the setting to help get the story ready and prepare you for what's about to come. The second thing that every story has to have, almost every single story you've ever heard has to have a conflict. And we don't want to hear that, but it does. About the only kinds that I've heard that don't have conflicts are European art films that are just a day in the life where nothing happens. But most people, when they watch that, don't totally understand why that was even made. See, because we expect conflict. Life has conflict in it. The conflict tells us what the story is about. Without the conflict, we're not sure how the change that's necessary is going to happen. The conflict helps us understand how we relate to it because it says they, the person in the story, have conflict like we have conflict, so now we can relate to them. And by the way, this conflict thing is so innate that multiple authors have studied children and realized that children understood that conflict was the start, the most powerful part of a good story, even in moments where they were barely able to talk and tell the story themselves. We get this. It's built into us that conflict is a part of our story. Which brings me to the third ingredient. How does it end? How does your story end? It has to have a resolution. It has to resolve. Now, let me be clear, and I'm going to talk about this in a second, but it has to resolve so that the audience has some sense of closure to the story. They want to know that, oh, the story's over. This is how it ended. That doesn't mean it has to end well, although most people like them ending well sometimes. It can end poorly, but it has to end. How does your story end is really about the resolution that we all long for in the stories that we live in. So let's talk about the resolutions, because ultimately there are only really 2 kinds of stories. And by the way, what I'm telling you isn't something new that I came up with, like I'm some story savant. This is Aristotle's Poetics. There are 2 types of stories. The first type of story is called a tragedy. A classic example of a tragedy would be Romeo and Juliet. So in a tragedy, the people in our story start off doing fairly well, they're okay, and then their life gets better up to a point. And then it starts going downhill and it ends poorly. It ends down. That's the key to understanding whether or not it's a tragedy or not. Does it end down? Let me give you an example with Romeo and Juliet. See, Romeo and Juliet, they were young teenagers, and they were excited and growing up in this world, and their families were in conflict, but they meet one another and experience the high point of love. Oh, Romeo, Romeo, we're so excited. Oh, it's amazing. Isn't love amazing? It's so good. And then they realize that they are the children of sworn enemies And as they try to make their love grow and flourish, they realize they are fighting a losing battle. And it keeps going downhill, and they try what they can to make it work. But it ends up that one of them has to fake their own death, and the other one finds them and commits suicide. And then the other one commits suicide when they find them. And it ends tragically with both of our young lovers who started off so well, both of them dead. This is tragic. And there's a reason that we tell tragic stories. We tell tragic stories because they evoke in us a sense of justice, a sense of that's not right, it shouldn't be like that, so that we can hear those tragic stories and go, I need to make sure that doesn't happen in my life or to the people that I know. We need to tell tragic stories because tragic stories help us hear about the injustices and the brokenness and the fallenness and the hurt in our world, and it evokes in us a sense of justice, but it also evokes in us a sense of compassion, so that we will act differently toward people when we hear tragic stories. We are moved to act. Tragic stories end down. If you saw me draw the arc, you can see that it's a frown. Usually when we're done with a tragic story, we frown because we don't like the ending. So what's the alternative? The alternative is a comedy. Now, when we hear the word comedy, we often think we mean, ha ha, we're going to laugh. No, comedy isn't necessarily about laughter. It's about a story arc that ends differently. See, in a comedy, typically, it starts off okay, and then everything falls apart. It goes bad, and usually quickly. And we spend the whole story with the person we're following actually struggling to climb, to rise out of the things that fell apart, to rise out of that to another great place so that it ends up. If tragedies end down, comedies end up. Let me give you another example of a famous example of young lovers. We'll go with The Princess Bride. The Princess Bride starts off and they fall in love, and then Wesley decides to leave to pursue his fortune so he can prove himself worthy of this woman, and he gets lost and captured, and everything falls apart, and he's lost at sea, and they think he might be dead, and so she moves on with her life because she thinks it's over. It falls apart, and then he comes back and he has to work and struggle and strive, and then with her move and work and struggle and strive to overcome the obstacles that are placed in their path for their love to thrive and succeed and grow, to live happily ever after. That's what a comedy does. It ends up, and we all walk away, if you can see me trace the line, with a big smile. Now, most of the Hollywood movies that are made nowadays are comedies. They end up. They have a lot of struggle of the hero, and they move up. We need to tell comic stories because they encourage us. They give us hope. They tell us that these kinds of stories can happen. So even in the midst of our own conflict, when we're not sure and we think it might end tragically, we can hear stories that are comedy, hear stories that make us smile and give us hope, and actually hopefully work, as I talked about last time, to act into those kinds of stories. That our struggle, that our conflict, that our attempts to rise have meaning and actually can move forward. Almost every single story we tell ends one of these two ways. Now, recently, there was a computer analysis done of thousands of stories. And in that computer analysis, they came back with 6 story arcs. 6 different story arcs that they said all stories conform to one of these 6 arcs, which, by the way, just happen to coincide with some things that Kurt Vonnegut proposed decades ago. But even in those 6 story arcs, they all still end up or down. They all still end comically with a smile or tragically down with a frown. So even if they go up and down a little bit or down and up, or they go all the way up or all the way down, they're still ending up or down, and we wind up with the same kind of outcome. It's important that we not simply tell one kind of story over the other. And I love the fact that the scriptures, the Bible, tells both kinds of stories. It doesn't just tell stories about hope and everything going well. It tells stories about people that make mistakes that are tragic and hurt them and the people around them, so that we can learn from their tragic mistakes and hopefully grow just as much as we can be encouraged when they save the day, kill the giant, win the battle. All of those things we need as we start to understand stories, so that as we create stories, which we're going to talk about in the next video, we can actually start thinking through, what kind of story do I need to tell in this moment? Do I need to tell one that ends up so people feel encouraged, or I need to tell one that ends down so that I evoke their sense of justice and compassion?